Going on, Ryan? How are you doing, man?
Man, I'm good. Stephen A., how you doing?
I'm tired as hell, but it's always good talking to you, my brother. I've been working like crazy for the last 3 months, but I'm here. Let's get started with the news yesterday that the feds were withdrawing some of the criminal allegations against Combs ahead of closing arguments today. The move was made as part of an effort to, quote-unquote, streamline instructions to the jury. Break this down for us, please. What exactly happened there, and what does it mean?
They are saying they're not going to argue the attempted arson and the attempted kidnapping parts of this case. Now, I want to specify, this does not apply to the arson that's being alleged against Kid Cudi's car. So that's one that I think a lot of people know about, that they've heard about, that's attracted a lot of attention. That's still going to be part of what they're arguing. But what they're trying to do, this kind of, to me, relates more to the RICO case than anything else. In a RICO case, which is the big charge against Sean Diddy Combs, you get to bring in all this evidence, all this information. You're trying to basically say Diddy and somebody else or other people, maybe his entourage, other people in his orbit, got together, committed at least two crimes in a 10-year period in furtherance of the criminal enterprise. But the problem is they've offered so much information in this thing that they have to try to streamline things for the jury. This is why in this kind of case, closing argument becomes everything. Because you have to take all this evidence, all this information, all these witnesses, and you got to show that RICO. You've got to show that others got together, they did these two crimes or more in this period of time. But after you start throwing in attempted arson, attempted kidnapping, and you don't think you have a good case against that, you run the risk of the jury saying, well, I don't believe those things, so I don't believe the whole thing. Instead, they're focusing a lot on bribery as some of the crimes committed. They're going to probably talk about Kid Cudi's car. They're talking about things like drugs and things like that. All these things are the crimes they're saying are part of RICO, are part of the sex trafficking. And they're doing this so that jury of 8 men and 4 women ages 30 to 74 don't get confused in all this information.
Yeah, but you say they're doing it not to get confused. What about those who would argue that they're trying to modify their allegations and their accusations against Sean Diddy Combs because they didn't make a strong enough case, and now they're trying to cover themselves? What about those who believe that?
You know, it's not a bad argument, because in some ways you got to wonder if somebody on that, it only takes one. I always want to say that. It only takes one, because this decision has to be unanimous. It only takes one juror to say, I'm not buying something here. I don't believe this. I see reasonable doubt. And you could argue that maybe a juror will look at this and say, well, what about this thing that I thought I heard about an attempted arson or kidnapping? Now, what the prosecution is trying to do is trying to say that's not going to be part of the instruction, so you're not even supposed to think about that stuff. But we can't control human nature of what they might have heard. I do understand people saying, hey, they didn't prove something here, so they're trying to cover themselves. But this does happen in cases sometimes. You present a lot in a case. You're trying to determine what is part of the case, especially as you're trying to tie it up in closing arguments. And you try to get in the instructions, hey, tell the jury not to consider these things because this is not part of what we're trying to do. And Stephen A., the flip side of, I think, people trying to criticize the prosecution on this is the fact that the prosecution is in there right now saying there are a whole host of crimes that were a part of the criminal enterprise. We don't need those two because we got scores of others that Diddy did here. And so that, to me, says the prosecutor is just trying to say, we don't have to consider everything we've talked about, but we have a lot of stuff that he did wrong that's criminal that we can still convict him on. And jury, you should look at that.
But Ryan, what really, really resonates with me, man, is that it's been 6 weeks of testimony, and then the defense has its turn, and they don't put on a single witness. It's almost like they're saying, we ain't worried about this. This is nothing. They have no case against us. Why should we even waste our time? That's how they're coming across right now, Ryan.
It's not a good sign for the prosecutors. And in some ways, this is something I love talking about when you talk about juries. I think sometimes people look at that and they say, well, that's a problem for the defense. They got to put somebody on. They put Diddy on. First of all, the last thing you want to do is put him on the stand. That's a last-ditch effort. We have no chance. We got to go for this. And that's not where they are right now. But more than that, you're right, Stephen A. They're trying to portray to the jury, we got this. There's nothing to see here. And we're going to show you that in our closing arguments. You know what I found interesting? The thing they did present in the 23 or so minutes they had was the loving text messages between Cassie and Diddy. That's the defense trying to restate one very important thing in all of this: consent. That's the defense's whole case: consent. Yes, he might be a bad man. Yes, you might think the freak-offs are terrible. Yes, you might even think he's an abusive man. But are these consensual relationships? Say, for example, the sex trafficking, the whole idea that Jane and Cassie were compelled to engage in commercial sex acts under fear of force or coercion. They're going to undermine that, the defense will, by saying, look at these loving text messages. Look at how these women wanted to do this.
Hold it.
So, go ahead.
It's not just the loving text messages, Ryan. Am I wrong when I say I could have sworn I've seen where there were freak-offs that occurred without him by those two, Jane and Cassie? Correct me if I'm wrong. If I'm wrong about Cassie or Jane, please correct me right here on camera. My understanding is that every freak-off didn't involve P. Diddy. It involved them doing it on their own with others of their own volition, not forced at all. Am I correct?
I think you're right about that. But here's the thing. The prosecution even tried to touch on that in their closing arguments by saying, you don't have to believe that he orchestrated and did something wrong at every freak-off. All you got to believe is it happened once. That's it for the sex trafficking. All you got to believe is it happened once. No, it's true.
So
it's
in other words, hold on, Ryan. Excuse me for interrupting. So you're trying to tell me that if on their own they engaged in several freak-offs, but then there was one that he was involved in that they could literally try to instruct the jury, pay attention to the one, not the others that you did of your own volition?
No, they're saying this. Here, I get what you're saying, but here's what I'm saying they're trying to show the jury. They're trying to show the jury that this happened over and over again. These women were forced in some ways to be a part of this, and that all of these things show what he was doing all along. And what they're trying to show to the jury, though, is maybe something that you're reflecting a good point. You're reflecting the point of somebody might look at one of these freak-offs and say, where's Diddy in all this? They, even in their closing argument, said, you don't have to believe that every single freak-off was him threatening violence or coercion. Just once, either to Cassie or Jane. That is sex trafficking because it's an act of sex trafficking. It's an act of the predicate offense of sex trafficking they're trying to forward here. So I get your point, but they're trying to battle that point as we speak in the courtroom by saying, we offered all this evidence. We offered all this evidence to show you the world that he created in this criminal enterprise that he was in charge of. But you don't have to believe that every single moment he was threatening violence, every single moment he was threatening coercion. It can be once, it can be twice. And if you see that, you have to convict him. But your point is a good one.
What about the once, the twice? No. What about the once or twice or 5 times or 10 times they did it on their own? Listen, I'm not trying to get him off. I got nothing in this game. If he's guilty, he's guilty. If he's innocent, he's innocent. I don't know. I know what I saw in that video with him hitting Cassie. He ain't no getting around that. He can't come back from that. But anything else involving in sex trafficking and racketeering, I'm in no position to judge him. But what I'm saying is, not only have we heard testimony about them having freak-offs without him, we even saw or heard of them having their preference about who was going to be involved in the freak-offs. So all of that points to consensual, more so than anything else, wouldn't you say, Ryan?
The problem is, in some ways, yes. And let me touch on reasonable doubt in that. But what they're saying is, think about the rest of the testimony with Cassie, the rest of the testimony with Jane, because that was part of what the defense pushed back on when they were both on the stand. And they both mentioned, I felt like this would happen if I didn't do these things. Jane even mentioned the point of, hey, if I didn't get to choose the escorts, if I'm going to be put in this horrible situation that I'm coerced to be in, at least I want to have a say on who I have to have sex with. And so that's the situation they're trying to build out here. But what I like about what you're saying, Stephen A., is you are channeling one of those 8 men and 4 women possibly in that jury box. And I say this again, the ages are 30 to 74. I say that because you never can really account for how that wide range of ages might look at this thing. They might look at that and say exactly what you're saying. Well, wait a second. They were setting up some of these things. Well, wait a second. I didn't see Diddy in all of this. And if just one has reasonable doubt, you lose that conviction. I think that's the risks that the prosecution ran in a case like this. And I think it's the problem with a RICO case. You bring in all this evidence, but if all of the evidence doesn't necessarily point to what you're trying to prove, it can be a problem.
As it pertains to jury selection, when you talk about the wide range, 30 to 74, who does that favor? The defense or the prosecution? having a wide range in a jury because, again, all it takes is one, right? So chances are from 30 to 74, cats are going to think differently. And if they're going to think differently and all it takes is one, it would seem to me that a jury ranging that wide would benefit the defense.
I would say this. If the prosecution can't do a fantastic job of tying all this together and making it crystal clear to everybody in that courtroom, yes, he ran this enterprise. Yes, he and others got together and did these criminal acts over this 10-year period in furtherance of the enterprise, for RICO at least, the sex trafficking, the transportation of prostitution, that seems like they can get a conviction there. But unless they can do that clearly, it favors the defense. Why? Because the defense looks at this jury and they see one person they think might be favorable, and they just talk to that person, or talk to those two people, or talk to those three people. You don't look at a closing argument in a case like this with that wide range. And the wide range isn't uncommon for cases like this. But what I'm saying is, for defense attorneys, you look at a case like this and you say, I only got to convince one. I don't have to convince all of them. All I got to do is convince one strongly who can go in that jury room and say, you guys, I see what you're saying, but I'm not buying it. I'm not buying it. And if you can get somebody to do that, then you win. I think that favors the defense unless the prosecution can do a stellar job.
Let's get down to it when it comes to you, Ryan Smith. Based on what you've heard, did the feds make their case on all the charges facing Diddy?
Transportation of individuals to engage in prostitution, yes. Because there's definitely evidence there's witnesses who come forward, talk about calling this person, they come across state lines. That, I think, is easier to solve. That is not the biggest charge, though. In terms of RICO, in terms of sex trafficking, I don't know. And I wouldn't say no, because we're not in that courtroom. And so much is relying on them tying everything together today, right now, with what they're saying in those closing arguments. But here's my problem. They talk about Diddy getting together with all these people. They talk about that one of his assistants, people like Christina Quorum, who's one of these people who sets these things up, who people were talking about a lot in the courtroom. I had a little bit of a problem that I didn't hear from all of these people, because you're saying Diddy, and in order to do RICO, you have to say Diddy and others did these things in furtherance of the enterprise. Where are the others? Some of the others came forward. But if you're that jury and you don't believe that all these others are part of this enterprise, then you're searching for the other people, then doubt comes in. So right now, I would say, based on what we've seen, I think the prosecution has a strong case, but it is definitely not a slam dunk. It is definitely not clear. There's big differences between this and R. Kelly case and RICO, for example. And this is not something that I think is an easy one to prove for them. So I think it's 50-50.
Jury deliberations, how long you anticipate this could go? Because the trial could end, whether it's tomorrow or it could end by Monday, and then jury deliberations kick in. How long do you anticipate that'll take?
It can go days. But I'll say one thing. What's going to be interesting to me, and what I think people should keep an eye on, will the judge give the jury this case on Friday? It's a very small point, but sometimes when juries have a case on Fridays and they really want to go home and they really want to be done, they rush it. And you could have a verdict on Friday. My sense here is the judge might have them start on Monday, so they're really thinking it through and being thorough. And if that's the case, I think it could go on for days. And it's mostly because of that RICO charge. I think it is a very complicated thing that prosecutors have to do here to tie it all together to prove that case. And I think we see clearly, look, Stephen A., we can look at this case, no matter what you think. We see that Diddy is a bad guy. We see that he did bad things. But are they criminal things? Are they criminal things? And I don't know if we see that here. And I think that's going to take the jury a long time to sort out.
Very last question. I know this trial hasn't been televised. The judge didn't want that. That's why we see, the drawings and all of this other stuff. Is it possible that the judge may allow the verdict to be televised?
No, I don't think so. I think this is going to be shut down the whole way through. I think one thing that people can look for, though, even as they hear about the decision, is he convicted on one thing and not on others? And I will say this, Stephen A., if he's convicted, say, for example, on the transportation to commit prostitution, but not on the other two, that is a loss for the prosecution, a huge loss, because you want to get him on that top charge. You mentioned it at the very beginning. He faces life in prison. That's for those things like sex trafficking, for RICO conspiracy. And if they don't get convictions on that, that is a huge loss, not only for this case, but for a prosecutor's office that is trying really hard to hold powerful people accountable for what they consider to be criminal acts created by an enterprise. If they can't get a conviction here, that's a problem on those big two charges.
Tonight, we are heading into the final stretch of the bombshell criminal trial of Sean Diddy Combs. In a marathon session that lasted nearly 5 hours, the prosecution presented its closing argument to the jury today. Assistant U.S. Attorney Christy Slavic highlighting the lurid government evidence that the jury has been shown during the course of this trial, including the video of Combs's 2016 hotel assault on Cassie Ventura, pictures of a bruised and beaten Ventura, and angry audio messages from the music mogul. Slavic contending it all backs up the government's charges of racketeering, sex trafficking, and transportation to engage in prostitution, all of which could potentially put the mogul away behind bars for life. I'm criminal trial attorney Sarah Azari, and this is Serving Justice. So how did the prosecution do on this very critical day? We're joined today by Dave Ehrenberg, former state attorney and author of Fighting the Florida Shuffle, plus Sophia Samia Lee, News Nation digital reporter who has been following this trial very closely since the beginning, and News Nation field producer Tommy Cristaldi, who has been a diligent presence in court throughout this trial, and he was in the courtroom today. So, wow. All right, I want to start with Dave. I expected this closing argument. I expected this. It wasn't like surprising to me. And frankly, I was a little underwhelmed. Okay. How do you think the prosecution did today in closing?
They were fine, but they didn't have to overwhelm. I thought the defense, which wanted extra time, didn't want the jurors to be yawning during their closing. They wanted the break. I thought they need the knockout punch because they didn't put on any evidence. The prosecution has been talking to the jury through their witnesses and their evidence for many weeks now. And so, yes, it's good to sum it all up, but you don't need something super powerful when their witnesses, especially Cassie, did the talking for them. The defense, on the other hand, needs something because they had nothing. They offered nothing, gave the jurors nothing. And so that's why they want the jurors to be attentive when they go, which is why they wanted the break between the prosecution and their closing.
And what a gift that is, right, Dave? I love, and I rarely get an overnight, prep for my closing argument, as opposed to barely a lunch hour. I thought that was a gift to the defense. Sophia, there was a lot for the jury to take in today. Do you think they made a compelling case for guilt on all of these charges?
In my opinion, they got some good ones. They didn't get some good ones, not on all the charges. I think sex trafficking, the charges particularly relating to Cassie, yes, completely compelling. They showed force, they showed coercion, they showed trauma. I think with respect to Cassie, they definitely did what they needed to do. Jane, on the other hand, I didn't see it as much. They tried to talk about how there was fake promises and the financial abuse, and I did not find it as persuasive as the presentation for Cassie. I think that Jane, the charges with respect to Jane is going to be really difficult. Racketeering, that's the big one. That I think is the main one that we're all like, is it going to happen or not? I thought they did a good job of hitting the predicate acts they wanted to with the forced labor. They talked about how transportation to engage in prostitution could count, which was a good idea. I think they did a good job.
Wait a minute, though.
Yeah.
I don't care how many predicate acts you have. If you don't have that criminal enterprise, and by the way, a big question for these jurors, Dave, correct me if I'm wrong, is where the hell is that co-conspirator? You've talked about the text messages. You've brought up her name left and right. She is not here. Neither are your two other victims. So those holes are holes that the jury is going to also take note of. And I don't think, I think that they started with their weakest evidence and they ended with the strongest evidence, right? They started with racketeering, and I don't care how many times you call a tomato a potato, it doesn't turn into a potato just because you keep saying it's a criminal enterprise, and then they went to Jane, which again was a weaker sex trafficking charge. Then they went to Cassie, then they went to the prostitution. So I thought that was an interesting escalation of weak to strong, but I don't I'm not convinced about the criminal enterprise. I'm just not.
They did bring up, though, the bodyguards getting the drugs, setting up the rooms, locking Cassie. So they did talk about specific acts that people who worked for Diddy did, which I thought was really good, because I think they definitely wanted to set that up for jurors to say, if you're looking for this, look at this. If you're looking for that, look at that. So.
Well, and I think it was also interesting that they almost made it sound like some drug trafficking organization, which is typical for Rico. That these employees or his entourage would bring the drugs in, that they would supply the drugs. So it started to sound like you're talking about a DTO as opposed to a music mogul's staff, Dave, the prosecution kept repeating a refrain that Combs and his inner circle would not take no for an answer. Do you think the jury bought that? And isn't the jury wondering where the hell is Christina Coram, the complicit co-conspirator?
Yes, I do think they're going to wonder where KK is. And if they don't wonder, I think the defense will prod them in that direction. I think the defense will remind the jurors that the prosecution has made promises they did not deliver. Where is witness number 3, right? Victim number 3 and 4. In fact, 2 of the victims that they promised didn't show. And then KK wasn't there, who was mentioned throughout the trial. That's a problem for the prosecution. But I do agree that as they go on, they have a stronger hand with Cassie, who was a very effective witness. I do think they've established human trafficking, and I do, for her at least, not as sure about Jane. Right. And I do think they've established the Mann Act violations. It's not the most serious of the crimes, but it could get him incarcerated. So I think that if they get a conviction on 2 of the 3 counts, even if it's not Jane but Cassie in the human trafficking count, I think it's a victory for the prosecution.
Yeah, because the Mann Act violation carries a max of 10 years. There's no mandatory minimum, but the sex trafficking carries a 10 or 15-year mandatory minimum, depending on how it's charged. So he's doomed, whether he goes down on both charges or one. And that idea of where's KK, where are the other 2 victims, it feeds into what I believe the defense is going to argue as well, which is they're prosecuting this guy because he's Sean Combs. Because this district has a pattern of going after rich, famous people to try to bring them down. This is not a regular guy. And they were overzealous. They are overreaching. Look, they promised you things that they didn't deliver, like you said, Dave. Tommy, boy, I've been wanting to talk to you all day. Combs reportedly kept his head down during the prosecution's closing arguments, at times looking kind of dejected and flat. But I'm really more interested in how the jurors were looking, right? Did you pick up any signs from these jurors as the prosecutor was delivering the closing?
I saw a couple things that I was surprised to see. I think in regards to Sean Combs, he reacted much in the same way that he has been. He looked down when things were embarrassing for him. He nodded along when the prosecutors mentioned that Mia said that sometimes working for him was wonderful. It was everything we've come to expect from Diddy. However, moving to the jury, there's one juror in particular who I've kind of felt like the entire time has been skeptical of the prosecution's case. She's kind of made some faces. I've been picking up on it a little bit, and maybe I'm misreading. It's just my own interpretation. But I did notice today that she was nodding along when they were describing the way that Sean Combs controlled every aspect of Cassie's life down to her fingernails. Her fingernails, the way she wears her hair. I noticed that this juror, and this is one that I've been looking at in particular because to me, she is seen skeptical, suddenly invested. And I don't want to say that she maintained that all day. I don't think that she did. There were times when she was taking a bit of a pause, blinking for an extended period of time, we'll say. But I noticed that in that moment, she was locked in. And I think if we're going to speak to the idea that, okay, they've done a really good job of proving specifically the charges related to Cassie, I think that that is a sign, to me at least, that even some of the jurors that I didn't think were buying into this maybe are. The other thing I saw was a juror nodding pretty intently when there was discussion about how KK texted Jane to tell Jane to distribute drugs or bring drugs with her. It just seemed to me, this was early on in the morning, so it was while the jury was at their most attentive, but I noticed that they were nodding along there as well. And then the other thing that I observed in the courtroom was that, so all of his family was there today. Like everybody showed up.
His daughters,
His daughters were there. And I did notice, and maybe this is just me reading too much into it, his daughters seemed a little bit surprised at the photos of the arson to Kid Cudi's car. They looked upset. They looked surprised. That was the one big moment. For the most part, the family was stoic. They were paying attention to the PowerPoint, they were watching, but I did notice that one of the twins seemed really moved by that particular predicate act of racketeering. So just things I
but remember that was speculative evidence. That I think the defense is going to argue that that there was no investigation or prosecution of the arson or the other crime related to Cuddy breaking into his home, threatening to kill him, and that But then the prosecution I think did a good job by saying, look, what is this, a coincidence that around the same time that he threatened to do these things, that these things actually happened? Again, they
happened when he threatened to do it, and then as soon as he hashed things out with Cuddy, they stopped happening. So they did say, what, you think this is a coincidence? And I thought it was a compelling argument, though of course I hear what you're saying. There was no prosecution for that, et cetera. So we'll see how it goes.
Also, more importantly, I think you can prove all these predicate acts beyond a reasonable doubt. They don't have to be charged or convicted. They're predicate acts. They're just criminal acts. But you still need a criminal enterprise. And that's, I think, the problem that they have here, and the missing co-conspirator. But the first one...
Sarah, I have a question for you. And
Dave.
Too. Yeah. They kind of got into like him obstructing after Cassie's lawsuit came out, and the obstruction and the interference. Do you think that was kind of putting it in the juror's brain that the reason KK didn't show up or the other two didn't show up is because he was trying to do something behind the scenes to make that not happen, and that he was interfering, he was obstructing?
They could. You're right. I think, Dave, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you're right. I think they're alluding to that because they can't really say it because they don't have evidence of it. But they're certainly alluding that this guy's an obstructionist. Obstruction of justice is a method and means of the racketeering charge as well. And I took it also to be an explanation for the rent payment continued to be made almost. Like I got a sense like they were trying to say that, oh, don't be fooled by him continuing to pay the rent for Jane. It's because he's trying to obstruct justice. He's hoping that will sort of buy her testimony, essentially. Right, Dave?
Yeah, well, obstruction is a double whammy because it is a predicate crime for racketeering, but also it's consciousness of guilt. Who obstructs but people who are guilty, right? You don't try to intimidate witnesses or obstruct justice unless you're guilty. So it's a double whammy for prosecutors, and I think that's a really good pickup there.
Yeah, and then this goes to all of you, really. How do you think the defense, besides coming in with the punches and all that, will respond tomorrow after seeing what the prosecution did? I, for one, believe that they are going to go hard on Cassie. They didn't go hard on her on cross-examination because she was a victim of abuse. It was documented. That tape was seen over and over and over again. But I think in closing, they have to, because I think the evidence of sex trafficking for Cassie was pretty compelling. Other than that, I want to hear from you guys. What do you think the defense should do? Let's go with Dave first.
Oh, I think they're going to have to go after Cassie. They treat her with kid gloves. The woman prosecutor, she was pregnant. She was crying on the stand. I mean, she was a very powerful witness. But now that she's gone, they can trash her. But they'll do so in the context of all the witnesses who are, in their minds, money grubbers. Jane didn't perform as well, and they'll tie Cassie and Jane together. They're all getting paid. They're all interested in the same thing. They all filed civil lawsuits. And yes, we're admitting that our client's not a good guy sometimes, that he committed domestic violence, but this is not the venue for a domestic violence case. He's not being charged with domestic violence. He's being charged with something else. What, human trafficking? Racketeering? You think this is the mob? What? This is a music group. This is a rap record label, right? And so you have maybe some overzealous friends of his who are trying to, be cool to Diddy. But, is this really an organized effort? And I'm with you. I think they're going to use the lack of an ongoing criminal enterprise, because I do think that's the weakness in the prosecution case, to cast doubt on everything, to say, this is just a guy acting badly at times. It should not be in this court. If they want to prosecute him in state court, so be it, but not here in federal court.
Yeah, and I also think that money grab, like you said, Dave, was the star witness that we didn't hear from that is going to be argued. Money grab is the idea that, you know what these two relationships had in common? Of course, there were the freak-offs that were consensual, but both of these women were in it for opportunity. And so the prosecutor telling you that they didn't leave out of fear of what's going to happen to them, no. they didn't leave because they would lose the get.
Right.
They were in it for an opportunity. One wanted a career, one wanted fame, the other one wanted her rent paid and her, expensive handbags or whatever it was. So, Sophia, what do you think? What are you expecting from the defense tomorrow?
I agree with you too. They're definitely going to go after Cassie in a way that they didn't before, for good reason, obviously. They are definitely going to try to discredit her. They're going to kind of stay the course with consent. This was an alternative lifestyle. Don't judge him by what he did in the bedroom, exactly what you guys are saying. And I also think that because they have some time to prepare, the prosecution today was talking about use your common sense. Put 2 and 2 together. Just because this isn't there, you can just make the connection.
Yeah.
So they're going to say, that's a hole. That's them saying they didn't do their job. So you make the connection for them. Mm-hmm. And, you fill the hole for them by putting 2 and 2 together or using your common sense. So I think they're going to say that's a lack of evidence. That's a lack of a witness. And that's why that didn't work out. I think that's
a failure. I think they're going to hammer the burden of proof. I mean, the fact that beyond a reasonable doubt is such a high standard that they are so far from that. Look at all these holes, look at all these problems. Like, don't be fooled by this. Yeah, I think they're going to really rely on or lean into the standard. Tommy, what are you expecting from the defense tomorrow?
I'm not entirely sure. I mean, I agree with what you guys have said so far, what they're going to do. They're going to go hard on Cassie. They're going to point out all the conclusions that have to be drawn and the reasonable doubt of it all. I think that the thing that I'm left thinking after today, and considering my position as the layperson in the chat, I went into this really feeling like, okay, Sean Combs is a bad dude. And over the course of our chats over the past 7 weeks, I have really seen that there are some elements lacking in this case. Jane's testimony was weak. There were some times when, with Bana, things didn't line up, and they addressed that today. The thing that I left feeling today was, wow, the prosecution really tied it all together, except I have no doubt that I'm going to leave tomorrow feeling the same way about the defense. I know that whatever, it doesn't matter how I'm feeling right now because tomorrow's a new day. And I think that I feel like, especially as it pertains to the racketeering thing, I wasn't sold on that at all. And after today, I suddenly understand what racketeering is more than I did before today. And I understand that it happened. However, I think that tomorrow the defense is going to get in there and they're going to tell me exactly why I'm wrong. And I'm sure that it's going to be compelling. And I look forward to hearing it. I think that I am trying really hard to remind myself that we still have the other side to hear and that this isn't as open and shut as the prosecution made it out to be today.
Well, and I hope that the jurors are as open-minded as you, Tommy, because if this guy's going down on sex trafficking, I think there are a lot of men in transactional relationships with arm candy that, do freaky things in the bedroom. And if there's shame or remorse years later, they could have a problem. I mean, I think it's a dangerous precedent, even though I understand that there's a compelling case with.
Well, but what do you say to, and this is a genuine question, what do you say to the idea that there were times when they expressed to Sean Combs, hey, we don't want to do this right now? Because one of the things the prosecution said
I know what you're talking about.
Stood out to me was it only has to be once. And we know that with consent, it's, consent once is not consent forever, but that's not even what they're talking about here. If there was one single instance of force, fraud, and coercion, at least that's how I understood it today. So there were times when these women said to him, we don't want to do this. And then they happened they outlined examples for each of them. And that's part of what I found compelling. Even with Jane, who didn't have the strongest testimony the first time, I felt like when they pointed out the time, and again, they brought up that summary chart. She was flying to New York City thinking they were having a fun weekend together. While she was on the plane, he was setting up an escort. And by the time she landed, surprise, this is happening. They said that was a material lie or whatever the phrase is.
It's like fraud. It's like fraud, because it's force, fraud, or coercion. But you know what the defense has? Remember those text messages where their nicknames for the guys, their favorite guys, they're sexting with the guys. There's, the idea that he's asking, are you cool with it? Are you down for it? We'll do it if you're cool with it. There's also those messages. So it's such a split screen here. And, the problem I have, to your point, where tomorrow's a new day and you're going to hear the compelling argument from the defense, the prosecution gets the last damn word, which I hate. So then you're going to be like, shoot, this, and now this, I just don't think this is going to, I don't think we're going to have a verdict by the 4th.
One thing that I think that stood out was that fact that they really pushed on the fact that at some points these women were sleep deprived and sick and had infections and still had to do it. And Diddy was like, come on, buck up, let's keep going. Let's take it to the end. I mean, if you're all in it and you're sick and you've got a urinary tract infection, and you don't want to do it, I think that was smart for the prosecutors to highlight, because that seems like, okay, that's pretty awful that some of them were vomiting.
I think the fact that to be with Diddy, at least in this category of a girlfriend, right? Because he kind of had a caste system going on, it appears, in his life. But if you were the side chick who did the freak offs, right? There was a tit for tat. I'm making you a star, but you're going to come on red carpets and you're going to do the freak offs. With Jane, it was like, I'll pay your rent and you're going to do the. But the thing is I'm looking at the broader, where is the evidence that what would happen to them if they left the relationship? See, I don't see the lack of agency and autonomy to leave the relationship.
For Cassie too, though, Sarah? You think for Cassie as well?
Yeah, I mean, well, it's a toss-up for me. Cassie's a toss-up for me.
That's why she's such a powerful witness. That's why she's the best witness.
Yeah.
And she's
if he's guilty on Cassie, he's still getting a mandatory minimum of 10 or 15 years. You know what I mean? So me, it's like, who cares about Jane? And
But isn't the idea, though, that it doesn't matter that, yes, they were getting these things most of the time, and there were times, and the prosecution fully acknowledged, there were times when these women agreed to do these things enthusiastically, openly. Yes, let's try it. But the thing that they said today that really stood out to me was even just one instance. So you look at Cassie in the Intercontinental Hotel. She tried to leave. He beat her. That's force. That happened one time. We've seen the video. That's the one. That's it. Check. Done. Guilty. Or with Jane, it's the lying while she was on the plane, or it's the time that they got into a fight. And one of the things that they said was, it doesn't matter that Jane shoved his head into that countertop first. He kept going. And they drew attention to the fact that he said to her, I think it was that night, he said, is this coercion? Why would he say that if he wasn't guilty? So to me, the whole time I've been thinking, okay, obviously these women were getting something out of this. But what stood out to me, and maybe I'm just misunderstanding, is that it doesn't matter what they were getting out of it. All it takes is that one time.
Well, it depends. I think so that the prosecution is, just like they cherry picked evidence, they're parsing out these instances and reminding the jurors that, continued consent and then suddenly a lack of consent and there's force or fraud or whatever to get a freak off, that's enough for you to convict him. Right. But it just depends on how broadly or narrowly the jury, which one they'll adopt, because the defense is obviously going to go with the broad stroke type of approach. And I think ultimately, look, Diddy's the defendant on trial. That's a big deal. But there are higher stakes here. I think the verdict in this case is really the mirror we're going to hold up in society and in this post-Me Too moment, because I've never seen a case like this, and Dave, I think we need to revisit the RICO statute because, man, I mean, the legislative intent behind the statute is gone. I've had cases where doctors were supposedly racketeering, pharmaceutical people were racketeering. Now you got musicians racketeering. And I wonder, I know from experience that it's the prosecution's wild card, but I think it's going a little too far. But anyway, we are almost at the end. And I am so grateful for you guys for joining me tonight with such great insight on this case. And Dave, a special thanks to you for making time. I know you're super busy and promoting your book and running your practice and killing it down in Florida. So I'm very grateful for all of you for joining me. And to our viewers, thank you for following along. This case is still not over. It's at the last stretch, but we are on it. And we're going to be back tomorrow with more on the Diddy trial. And for now, the defense rests.
I'm Eva Pilgrim. Thanks for streaming with us. The high-profile Sean Diddy Combs sex trafficking and racketeering trial now in its final stage. Prosecutors presenting their closing arguments today, this after more than 6 weeks of testimony, some of it very graphic. The jury hearing from more than 30 witnesses, including Combs's ex-girlfriends, former assistants, male escorts, security guards, even another rapper and rival. The prosecutor in closing calling Combs the leader of a criminal enterprise who didn't take no for an answer, saying Combs, quote, forced and manipulated Cassie Ventura and Jane to have sex with escorts for his own entertainment and used power, violence, and fear to get what he wanted. Combs is the only defendant, but the prosecutor told the jury he did not act alone, saying, quote, he managed to do this for 2 decades because he used his money, his influence, and his inner circle to cover up his crimes. It's his kingdom. Everyone was there to serve him. Combs's children were in the courtroom today, including his 19-year-old twin daughters who haven't been there since the first days of the trial. Combs has pleaded not guilty to all charges. If convicted, he faces the possibility of life in prison. Later in the show, we have YouTube star Tisa Tells joining us live to talk about the commentary surrounding this high-profile trial. But first, let's begin tonight with ABC News Chief Investigative Correspondent Aaron Katersky live outside the federal courthouse here in Manhattan. And Aaron, prosecutors gave their closing arguments to the jury. What was it like inside the courtroom today?
First of all, Eva, it was packed. For the first time since the beginning of the trial, every member of the Combs family was there. All 6 of his children, his mom, they all crowded into the row designated for family. At one point, Sean Combs even seemed to be, saying squished together a little bit to make room. But there were attorneys for some of the witnesses. The U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York, Jay Clayton, was in the room to hear prosecutors give their closing statement. So it was packed. But for the start anyway, Sean Combs appeared pretty relaxed. He walked into the courtroom. He put his hand over his heart, a gesture toward his family. And he's been reading a book, The Power of Positive Thinking.
I'm curious, how was Combs? You mentioned it a little bit there. Did he interact any more with his family? What was his interactions with his attorneys like today?
A bit with the family. He did scribble a number of notes during the prosecutor's summation, writing them on little Post-its, handing them over to his attorneys. But at one point, I thought it was interesting. He sat far back, his chair pushed far back from the table, away from his usual confiding position with his attorneys, Eva, and had his head down, whether in thought or reading notes. But it seemed a moment where he might have been, as much as he can be these days, by himself.
I'm curious, Aaron, how long did the government's closing arguments take today?
It was almost 5 hours, and I have to say, it did not necessarily feel like it. The prosecutor's presentation for the last 7 weeks has been rather sprawling, and at times it felt disjointed. Witnesses testified that may or may not have had anything to do with one another. Today was the chance for prosecutors to try to tie all of that together, and all of the evidence about hundreds of freak-offs that the jury heard about, saw graphic footage of. And today, prosecutors said a single freak-off is enough, that the jury just had to find that sex trafficking elements were met by prosecutors one time in order to convict.
Can you tell us more about the prosecutor who delivered today's closing arguments?
Christy Slavic is an experienced federal prosecutor. She actually has a background in gangs and violent crime. And I think of the 6, she may have been one of the more effective during examinations of witnesses, prepared, methodical. And that was, I think, the characterization today, a methodical, what they hope is a devastating portrait of Sean Combs, not only as a sex trafficker, but someone who led a criminal enterprise with a cadre of loyal lieutenants. It was his kingdom, she said. They were there to say yes, because she said over and over in a rhetorical flourish, Sean Combs would not take no for an answer.
The defense will have their turn tomorrow. What can we expect from the defense for their closing arguments?
Defense attorney Mark Agnifilo, lead counsel, is going to deliver the defense closing. He said it would take about 3 hours. I wonder now if he goes a bit longer than that. But the defense did not call any witnesses and relied on cross-examination to poke holes in the accounts of the witnesses, look for him to repeat some of that and to portray Cassie Ventura and Jane not as victims of sex trafficking, but as willing girlfriends who participated in Sean Combs's polyamorous lifestyle for years.
Aaron Kontursky there at the courthouse for us. Thank you so much, Aaron. Now to break down what we heard today, ABC News legal contributor Brian Buckmeyer is joining me. I'm curious what stood out to you.
I think what stood out to me and what probably stood out to a lot of people are all the different ways that Sean Combs can be found guilty, especially when it comes to that RICO conspiracy. Now, yesterday we talked about the fact that they just have to find 2 predicate acts, and it doesn't have to even be the same predicate acts. If we're jurors, I can believe it be bribery and obstruction of justice. You can believe it's arson and sex trafficking. But even further into that, AUSA Slavic said, you know what? If you think there are 2 times that Sean Combs gave drug to someone else and there's a RICO conspiracy, that's enough. And so even within those individual predicate acts, multiple ones of them could carry the day for them in that top charge.
How do you think that the prosecutor did today? Do you think she gave the jury a clear picture, a clear understanding of these charges, of this case?
I would probably use clear understanding, clear picture, but I'd probably go a little further, a roadmap. I think she gave them an excellent roadmap to say, if you follow these instructions, if you follow these facts, if you follow these elements, the only destination you can come to would be that Sean Combs is guilty of the charges. Talking about the RICO conspiracy, again, that only 2 needed to be done to find him guilty, as long as there's a criminal enterprise. But also with the sex trafficking, that she conceded there might be some interaction between the 2 of them, especially talking about Jane, that first hotel night might have been consensual. But so long as there was 1 hotel night or 1 freak off or 1 king's night, whatever you want to call it, that's trafficking. And the simplicity of that and giving 3 great examples for both Jane and Cassie, I think really helped in creating that roadmap for the jurors.
Let's talk about the idea of criminal enterprise, because a lot of people watching all of this have been asking this question. Well, what was the goal of a criminal enterprise? Does it have to show some sort of goal?
I think this is the perfect definition that AUSA Slavic gave. And the goal was to force and manipulate Cassie Ventura and Jane to have sex with escorts for his own entertainment. And everything else was either to control them, meaning that arson of blowing up Kid Cudi's car allegedly to control Cassie to come back in, getting the drugs and distributing them to both Cassie and Jane to kind of ply them into doing this. The acts of violence, all of it, right? It was meant for this goal. And they're saying that there was a meeting of the mind, an implied agreement between those in his inner circle, being Sean Combs, to do this very goal.
The prosecutor told the jury that Combs was in charge and he had loyal lieutenants who made it all happen for him. Who were these people? Why does it matter? You know, Combs has pleaded not guilty to all of these charges. No one else has actually been charged.
Yeah, so Sean Combs, only defendant, as you described, right? When you're talking about loyal lieutenants, we're talking about Christina Corum and D-Rock, right? But also some of the security guards. And just to give you a heads up, this is just a few of them. We couldn't fit them all into a screen. But when we talk about foot soldiers, another thing that the AUSA talked about, we're talking about the assistants, right? Brendan Paul, Capricorn Clark, individuals who were not taking the lead, so to speak, in this criminal enterprise as the government is portraying it, but kind of did the marching orders, the setting up of the hotel nights, the getting the drugs, the things that facilitated many of these nights.
All right, Brian Buckmeyer, thank you so much for breaking that down with us. And with closing arguments in full swing, it won't be long before the case against Sean Combs finally goes to the jury. What will happen inside the closed doors of the deliberation room? Well, here to give us some insight into what that process may look like is Ross Suter. Ross is an attorney and jury consultant. He's joining us now from Pennsylvania. Ross, thank you so much for being here. You're not involved in this particular case, but you have studied juries for a while now, and I'm curious about those first couple of minutes that the jurors will get to spend together when they start deliberating. What do you expect that moment to be like?
Yeah, so they've had the opportunity to spend a lot of time together. They just have not been able to talk about the case. At least they're not supposed to be. So it is now their first opportunity to see where everybody stands, how they view the case, how they view guilt or innocence. And then they're going to start plowing through the evidence. There's obviously a lot of it. It's a 6-week trial with 34 or so witnesses. So there's a lot of information for them to start processing and getting into the group dynamic and start discussing, you know, what do we think happened here? What's our viewpoint individually and then collectively as a group? as to guilt or innocence.
Well, let's talk about the makeup of this jury. The youngest juror is just 30, the oldest 74. Some are from the city, others are from the suburbs. What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, they're all going to have different viewpoints, obviously. They're all bringing different life histories to the table. It's really going to be part of what drives their viewpoint of the case individually. And I step away a little bit from just the actual age demographics and things like that into more, how do they see the world? How do they view this case? I know during voir dire, there was a lot done about how people feel about celebrity and those type of issues. And now we have a jury panel of different individuals from different backgrounds, and they need to collectively now come together and come back to a group decision.
I'm curious because every witness that these jurors saw was called by the prosecutors. Do you think that will have surprised them, and how might that weigh into how they view this case?
I'm not sure if they'll be surprised per se. I know people generally understand that it's always the burden of proof on the prosecution. So the defendant doesn't have to put any evidence out there. And as it was stated earlier, their role was to punch holes in the evidence the prosecution was submitting into evidence. So it's a strategic, calculated risk to not put somebody up there, and you hope, or you're minimizing the risk by staying defensive, but still at the same time, you don't want that silence to be equated as to some type of admission of guilt.
Ross Suter, thank you so much for your insight. Still ahead, after more than 6 weeks of testimony about alleged sex, drugs, and violence, we are going to break down the prosecution's closing arguments. Stay with us. Welcome back. The Sean Diddy Combs trial is in its final phase. The prosecution delivering its closing arguments today, with the defense giving its summation tomorrow. Time to break down the strengths and weaknesses of the case the prosecution presented to the jury. We have ABC News legal contributors Brian Buckmeyer and Bernardo Villalona. Bernardo, let's start with you. What do you think were the strongest moments for the prosecution today?
Strongest moments for the prosecution, I think, is the way that they organized their closing arguments. That was the strongest point for me, because you were able to follow everything that the prosecutor was saying. But in terms of their strongest point, I think the strongest piece of evidence, when they showed the 27 men on the screen, these 27 escorts on the screen, in between of escorts that Cassie engaged in sex trafficking, the ones that Jane engaged in sex trafficking, and the ones that both of them engaged in sex trafficking. Literally, we were all counting each line to see how many men it was. But in terms of the prosecution, why I go into that their strength was how they organized it, because they broke down the racketeering conspiracy, and they broke down the predicate acts and told you which facts and evidence made out the predicate acts. So you got the arson, kid cutting, the bribery, the security officer from Intercontinental Hotel, the possession with intent to distribute, the multiple players having to deal with that. So breaking that down, and then also me going into forcing this jury to know that all they have to prove is just one predicate act. So for example, the possession with intent to distribute, how many times did Sean Combs give drugs to Jane, to Cassie, or had Jane bring the drugs from California to Florida, or gave the packet of drugs to Brendan Paul, or anyone he gave drugs to? All it takes is one or two. You get two of those possession with intent to distribute, and you make out the racketeering conspiracy.
Brian, what did you think?
I think the organization was great. And the reason why I think it works out to their benefit is because what you want is that the jury gets into the deliberation room and they use your roadmap, not the other side's roadmap. And they march through the case in the way that you told them to. You give them the tools and the way to operate through it. And I think what's really going to help them out, and the defense will do the same thing as well, any good attorney does this, is you mirror the language of the charge that you know the judge is going to say later on. And so when you say it once, and then the judge tells the jury, this is how you're supposed to look at the case, then they're like, oh wait, didn't Brian or or Bernarda say this exact same thing, maybe I should follow that direction. I think the organization is what really helped them here.
Yeah. The flip side of that, though, I'm curious, what do you think the weakest moments were?
For me, and maybe this is just my bias as a defense attorney, anytime a prosecutor makes a conclusory statement or say, well, you know that's true, and doesn't explain it, that to me gives me an opening to do some real damage as a defense attorney. So when you talk about the arson, does it seem like Sean Combs related to the arson? Absolutely. But they didn't give a lot of facts. It's like, well, you know he was part of it because there's no stuff that happened afterwards. So there's no other person who could have done it.
You had the email 2 weeks before, Cassie giving a heads up to her family member, like, look, I was threatened that he was going to release the videotapes, and he said that he's going to do something to Kid Cudi, and that he won't be in the country when it happens. And guess what? 2 weeks later, ding, ding, ding. Car is blowing up.
But you also know that Kid Cudi was with his ex-girlfriend's sister at the time. You also know that there's potentially female DNA on it. You don't know who Kid Cudi's dating also. That could have been the crazy-ass girlfriend there. You could have eliminated that as an option by giving facts to do so, rather than just leaving it. The other thing, the voice note where Sean Combs says, you don't want me to ghost you. She says, oh, he says he doesn't want to ghost you because he's going to stop paying rent. How do you go from, you don't want me to ghost you, to he means I'm not paying rent? These are conclusions that they're making of their own that I think opens them up for a defense attorney to say, here are logical leaps that they're making that you don't have to, and this could raise reasonable doubt.
Or were there weak moments that you were concerned about?
In terms of the weak moment, well, one thing just stylistically, that she was reading from her binder when she was projecting this closing arguments to the jurors. I don't really like the reading part because I want to engage, have the eye contact, and have the jurors looking at me and me looking at them, and we're engaging in a conversation. But in terms of evidence that she put forth in her arguments, I think the one having to deal with Bana and Nia, because we know that those were the weak witnesses in a sense, not really Nia, but Bana, because of that issue of credibility, having to deal with being dangled from the 17th floor, and that there was an issue with the date. But also in terms of not telling this jury how to evaluate credibility or believability, because they're taking for granted that just because I tell you this is the evidence and it's coming out of their mouth, that is necessarily true. I think they should have explained to this jury, you're going to have to evaluate credibility of these witnesses, and this is how you evaluate credibility of these witnesses, what motive or bias or inconsistencies that they had, where you know that you can believe them because of the lack of motive or no inconsistency, or if there is an inconsistency, is a minor one. So those parts, because you do have the ones that it's corroborated, that's easy for a jury. A jury could be like, there's corroboration, so I believe that part of her testimony.
Do you think the defense tonight is tweaking what they were planning to do for trial?
Absolutely. I would be shocked if Mark Niflo gets more than 4 hours of sleep tonight.
Right.
I think he should be getting the transcript as quickly as he can. In situations like this, as a defense attorney, you better have had a great relationship with a court reporter who's making the transcript. And so you're coming to them and say, hey, when you're done, I don't care how raw or how unedited it is, I need that transcript, because I'm gonna go line by line, looking at those statements that Bernarda brought up, looking at those conclusory statements, bringing in other facts and say, this is where they're wrong. This is why their interpretation of this is wrong. And then trying to poke holes in it in many ways as possible that is unimpeachable, because at the end of the day, AUSA Comey's going to come up for that rebuttal.
Yeah, and that's exactly it. The government gets one more chance at this after the defense is done. Brian Buckmeyer, Bernarda Villalona, thank you both for being here with us. Coming up, a closer look at what people are saying about the trial that has captivated the nation's attention. Stay with us. Welcome back. As the Sean Diddy Combs trial nears the end, we want to know what people are saying about this high-profile case that's captivating the country. And here to help me answer that is YouTube star and our friend now, Tisa Tells, who has been at the Manhattan Federal Courthouse every day since the start of this trial, giving her more than 500,000 subscribers an inside look into this trial. Tisa, thanks so much for being here. I'm really curious, what are you hearing from the people who are following you?
So, listen, the people that are following me really, really wanted the prosecution to pull through. And there's been a lot on the media because no one's in the courtroom exactly. So you really are going off of everybody's opinion. But one thing, whether there were the people watching the live tweets from what was going on in the courtroom, listening to my perspective or anybody else's perspective, everybody is super happy and super impressed with the prosecution's closing arguments.
As far as what their comments look like at the beginning versus what they look like now, has that changed at all after hearing all of these these witnesses?
Night and day. So in the beginning, people were saying, I don't see RICO. Where's the RICO? What's going on with the RICO? It was like hounding in the back of our heads. Nobody saw the RICO. However, of course, a lot of people, including myself, saw it early, but the vast majority of people did not see RICO. And even with the testimony, people were still like, I don't know, it seems suspicious. However, with these closing arguments, there is not one person, whether they support Diddy or not, saying they don't see a potential RICO case. So
you were in the courtroom.
Yeah.
Diddy's family was in the courtroom, so were his friends and his supporters. Give us sort of a view of what it was like in there today.
You know, it was actually kind of surreal, okay? You know, Diddy had what could be arguably called a few legal wins yesterday. And when he walked in, he seemed like he was in great spirits. That charm was on. He did his little love sign. He came in. He seemed like he was floating on top of the world. But as the prosecution's closing arguments kept moving forward, you saw his body language kind of slump a little. You saw him at one point, he was just looking straight. You know, and I get it. Somebody's saying that you're the devil and describing all these horrible things you did while your daughters are there and your kids are right behind you. I get it, but there was something more that he just started getting deflated to me as the prosecution kept making their closing argument. And again, it seemed like really good spirits. There was a packed house. Usually in the last couple of weeks, those rows for family have been pretty sparse. They've only been utilized about 20%. Today it was a packed house. But again, the high spirits they came in with kept getting lower and lower as the prosecution kept moving forward.
Content creators like yourself have really been giving people a different viewpoint, a different way to follow these kinds of trials. I'm curious the feedback that you have gotten as you've done this.
You know what? I've gotten a lot of really good feedback, but I think it's because the Southern District of New York, they don't let cameras in. So you really do need someone with their eyes and ears. And you guys do a great job of that. But you know, you guys have set times that you can come on. So we've kind of filled a niche where it's like, yeah, I'll see you on break. I'll see you on lunch. And it's up to the minute. But they really like having us there as a fly on the wall, as a real person who doesn't really understand the legal side, but you're doing your best to figure it out. And you're literally just going off of the body language, what you see, what people are thinking and feeling. It's been an incredible outpouring of support, but you know what? I am trying to be the coverage that I wish I could see too. Like, let me know exactly what's going on. Oddly enough, the content creators, we might be the reason why the Southern District of New York changes their policies about having video.
We would all like to have some cameras in the courtroom. Do you have any plans for what you're going to do next?
You know,
because this has been weeks.
Yes, it has been weeks, but now I have this live trial bug in me that I just can't get out. I'm thinking about covering the Idaho 4. Of course, everybody is looking for the cutie patootie Luigi Mangione trial to go forward, and also just covering more court cases. But one thing is true, I think the fallout from the Diddy verdict, no matter what it is, I think it's going to be something that really has shockwaves for the next couple of weeks. You know, both sides, of course, feel super strongly, but the shockwaves of what it means for the rap industry, what it means for the record industry, and just what it means for society and people commenting about whether he got a raw deal or not, I think it's going to be weeks.
Tisa, thank you so much for being here with us.
Thank you. It's always great seeing you.
And thank you for joining us. We'll be here tomorrow for the defense's closing arguments and for verdict day. The show streams right here on ABC News Live, Disney Plus, and Hulu, weekdays at 5:30 p.m. Eastern and Pacific. For even more on the Diddy trial, make sure to follow our podcast, Bad Rap, The Case Against Diddy. It's hosted by our very own Brian Buckmeyer, wherever you listen to podcasts. I'm Eva Pilgrim in New York. Have a good rest of your day.
Trafficking, for RICO conspiracy. And if they don't get convictions on that, that is a huge loss, not only for this case, but for a prosecutor's office that is trying really hard to hold powerful people accountable for what they consider to be criminal acts created by an enterprise. If they can't get a conviction here, that's a problem.
Is an attorney and legal analyst extraordinaire for ABC News. You can also catch him on SportsCenter, hosting SportsCenter on ESPN. Please welcome back to the show the one and only Ryan Smith. What's going on, Ryan? How are you doing, man?
Man, I'm good. Stephen A., how you doing?
I'm tired as hell, but it's always good talking to you, my brother. I've been working like crazy for the last 3 months, but I'm here. Let's get started with the news yesterday that the feds were withdrawing some of the criminal allegations against Combs ahead of closing arguments today. The move was made as part of an effort to, quote-unquote, streamline instructions to the jury. Break this down for us, please. What exactly happened there, and what does it mean?
They are saying they're not going to argue the attempted arson and the attempted kidnapping parts of this case. Now, I want to specify, this does not apply to the arson that's being alleged against Kid Cudi's car. So that's one that I think a lot of people know about, that they've heard about, that's attracted a lot of attention. That's still going to be part of what they're arguing. But what they're trying to do, this kind of, to me, relates more to the RICO case than anything else. In a RICO case, which is the big charge against Sean Diddy Combs, you get to bring in all this evidence, all this information. You're trying to basically say, Diddy and somebody else or other people, maybe his entourage, other people in his orbit, got together, committed at least two crimes in a 10-year period in furtherance of the criminal enterprise. But the problem is they've offered so much information in this thing that they have to try to streamline things for the jury. This is why in this kind of case, closing argument becomes everything. Because you have to take all this evidence, all this information, all these witnesses, and you got to show that RICO. You've got to show that others got together, they did these two crimes or more in this period of time. But after you start throwing in attempted arson, attempted kidnapping, and you don't think you have a good case against that, you run the risk of the jury saying, well, I don't believe those things, so I don't believe the whole thing. Instead, they're focusing a lot on bribery as some of the crimes committed. They're going to probably talk about Kid Cudi's car. They're talking about things like drugs and things like that. All these things are the crimes they're saying are part of RICO, are part of the sex trafficking. And they're doing this so that jury of 8 men and 4 women ages 30 to 74 don't get confused in all this information.
Yeah, but you say they're doing it not to get confused. What about those who would argue that they're trying to modify their allegations and their accusations against Sean Diddy Combs because they didn't make a strong enough case, and now they're trying to cover themselves? What about those who believe that?
You know, it's not a bad argument, because in some ways you got to wonder if somebody on that, it only takes one. I always want to say that. It only takes one, because this decision has to be unanimous. It only takes one juror to say, I'm not buying something here. I don't believe this. I see reasonable doubt. And you could argue that maybe a juror will look at this and say, well, what about this thing that I thought I heard about an attempted arson or kidnapping? Now, what the prosecution is trying to do is trying to say that's not going to be part of the instruction, so you're not even supposed to think about that stuff. But we can't control human nature of what they might have heard. I do understand people saying, hey, they didn't prove something here, so they're trying to cover themselves. But this does happen in cases sometimes. You present a lot in a case. You're trying to determine what is part of the case, especially as you're trying to tie it up in closing arguments. And you try to get in the instructions, hey, tell the jury not to consider these things because this is not part of what we're trying to do. And Stephen A., the flip side of, I think, people trying to criticize the prosecution on this is the fact that the prosecution is in there right now saying, there are a whole
prosecution's closing
that were a part of the criminal enterprise. We don't need those two because we got scores of others that Diddy did here. And so that, to me, says the prosecutor is just trying to say, we don't have to consider everything we've talked about, but we have a lot of stuff that he did wrong that's criminal that we can still convict him on. And jury, you should look at that.
But Ryan, what really, really resonates with me, man, is that it's been 6 weeks of testimony, and then the defense has its turn, and they don't put on a single witness. It's almost like they're saying, we ain't worried about this. This is nothing. They have no case against us. Why should we even waste our time? That's how they're coming across right now, Ryan.
It's not a good sign for the prosecutors. And in some ways, this is something I love talking about when you talk about juries. I think sometimes people look at that and they say, well, that's a problem for the defense. They got to put somebody on. They put Diddy on. First of all, the last thing you want to do is put him on the stand. That's a last-ditch effort. We have no chance. We got to go for this. And that's not where they are right now. But more than that, you're right, Stephen A. They're trying to portray to the jury, we got this. There's nothing to see here. And we're going to show you that in our closing arguments. You know what I found interesting? The thing they did present in the 23 or so minutes they had was the loving text messages between Cassie and Diddy. That's the defense trying to restate one very important thing in all of this: consent. That's the defense's whole case: consent. Yes, he might be a bad man. Yes, you might think the freak-offs are terrible. Yes, you might even think he's an abusive man. But are these consensual relationships? Say, for example, the sex trafficking, the whole idea that Jane and Cassie were compelled to engage in commercial sex acts under fear of force or coercion. They're going to undermine that, the defense will, by saying, look at these loving text messages. Look at how these women wanted to do this.
Hold it.
So, go ahead.
It's not just the loving text messages, Ryan. Am I wrong when I say I could have sworn I've seen where there were freak-offs that occurred without him by those two, Jane and Cassie? Correct me if I'm wrong. If I'm wrong about Cassie or Jane, please correct me right here on camera. My understanding is that every freak-off didn't involve P. Diddy. It involved them doing it on their own with others of their own volition, not forced at all. Am I correct?
I think you're right about that. But here's the thing. The prosecution even tried to touch on that in their closing arguments by saying, you don't have to believe that he orchestrated and did something wrong at every freak-off. All you got to believe is it happened once. That's it for the sex trafficking. All you got to believe is it happened once. No, it's true.
So
it's
in other words, hold on, Ryan. Excuse me for interrupting. So you're trying to tell me that if on their own they engaged in several freak-offs, but then there was one that he was involved in that they could literally try to instruct the jury, pay attention to the one, not the others that you did of your own volition?
No, they're saying this. Here, I get what you're saying, but here's what I'm saying they're trying to show the jury. They're trying to show the jury that this happened over and over again. These women were forced in some ways to be a part of this, and that all of these things show what he was doing all along. And what they're trying to show to the jury, though, is maybe something that you're reflecting a good point. You're reflecting the point of somebody might look at one of these freak-offs and say, where's Diddy in all this? They, even in their closing argument, said, you don't have to believe that every single freak-off was him threatening violence or coercion. Just once, either to Cassie or Jane. That is sex trafficking because it's an act of sex trafficking. It's an act of the predicate offense of sex trafficking they're trying to forward here. So I get your point, but they're trying to battle that point as we speak in the courtroom by saying, we offered all this evidence. We offered all this evidence to show you the world that he created in this criminal enterprise that he was in charge of. But you don't have to believe that every single moment he was threatening violence, every single moment he was threatening coercion. It can be once, it can be twice. And if you see that, you have to convict him. But your point is a good one.
What about the once, the twice? No. What about the once or twice or 5 times or 10 times they did it on their own? Listen, I'm not trying to get him off. I got nothing in this game. If he's guilty, he's guilty. If he's innocent, he's innocent. I don't know. I know what I saw in that video with him hitting Cassie. He ain't no getting around that. He can't come back from that. But anything else involving in sex trafficking and racketeering, I'm in no position to judge him. But what I'm saying is, not only have we heard testimony about them having freak-offs without him, we even saw or heard of them having their preference about who was going to be involved in the freak-offs. So all of that points to consensual, more so than anything else, wouldn't you say, Ryan?
The problem is, in some ways, yes. And let me touch on reasonable doubt in that. But what they're saying is, think about the rest of the testimony with Cassie, the rest of the testimony with Jane, because that was part of what the defense pushed back on when they were both on the stand. And they both mentioned, I felt like this would happen if I didn't do these things. Jane even mentioned the point of, hey, if I didn't get to choose the escorts, if I'm going to be put in this horrible situation that I'm coerced to be in, at least I want to have a say on who I have to have sex with. And so that's the situation they're trying to build out here. But what I like about what you're saying, Stephen A., is you are channeling one of those 8 men and 4 women possibly in that jury box. And I say this again, the ages are 30 to 74. I say that because you never can really account for how that wide range of ages might look at this thing. They might look at that and say exactly what you're saying. Well, wait a second. They were setting up some of these things. Well, wait a second. I didn't see Diddy in all of this. And if just one has reasonable doubt, you lose that conviction.
telling the jury the hip-hop mogul wielded Sean Diddy Combs' legal team. They're going to make their closing arguments in his sex trafficking and racketeering trial. Prosecutors already made their closing arguments on Thursday, telling the jury the hip-hop mogul wielded power, violence, and fear. Also, that he thought his fame and fortune put him above the law. News Nation's Alicia Nieves joins us live from the courthouse. Alicia, it's not a usual practice for closing arguments to be split like this, right?
Yeah, good morning, Alex. A few things unusual with this case, especially at the end of it. First and foremost, the defense not calling any witnesses on their behalf. And so today, when they deliver their closing arguments, it's really going to be the first time we hear the full defense for this case for Sean Diddy Combs. But then secondly, the defense did make this special request asking that when they deliver their closing arguments, they do so to a rested jury kind of first thing this morning, rather than following the prosecution after their lengthy closing argument that did occur yesterday. The prosecution yesterday spoke directly to the jury for more than 3 hours. I mean, they had to summarize 28 days of testimony from more than 30 witnesses that they called to try and tie together this alleged, criminal enterprise and prove the charges against this music mogul, right? 1 count of racketeering conspiracy, 2 counts of transportation to engage in prostitution, and 2 counts of sex trafficking. Of course, Combs pleading not guilty to all of these charges. And so in closing arguments today, the defense expected to explain to the jury first and foremost why they did not call any witnesses to prove Sean Diddy Combs' innocence, as they allege. Based on what we have seen in opening statements and in cross-examination in this trial, it's really likely to be mentioned in the defense's closing argument that the prosecution last minute is no longer pursuing some of the predicate acts that pertain to that big charge, the racketeering and RICO charge, these predicate acts being attempted arson, attempted kidnapping. But the actual racketeering charge, that is still in play. There's been a lot of confusion of that over the last 24 hours. Now, the government is claiming this was an effort to make things easier for the jury, but the defense likely going to use this to portray some weakness in the government's case. Now, on News Nation now, attorney Joshua Scheifer shared what else the defense is likely to argue later on today when court resumes.
The question is whether the government's been able to show that there really is an organization, whether this is a business, whether this had a criminal intent. And the defense is going to focus on the idea that Mr. Combs is only being prosecuted because of his success.
Yeah, and along with that, it is very likely from his defense that we're going to hear kind of what we heard in opening arguments, that, listen, Sean Diddy Combs, not an angel, not a good guy here per se, but they're going to try and say that he is not, of course, guilty of the charges that he is accused of. We're expecting that defense attorneys are going to speak for about 3 hours today. Then the prosecution gets about an hour for rebuttal. And then it goes to jury instructions. And then the fate of Sean Diddy Combs in the hands of 8 men, 4 women, 12 juries. That deliberation could start as early as this afternoon, but more than likely on Monday.
Thank you for watching. Subscribe below and download our News Nation app right now on your phone, and you will get fact-based, unbiased news for all Americans.
On TMZ. The king and queen have now arrived in Venice. Jeff Bezos and Lauren Sanchez are ready to get married.
Yeah, Jeff Bezos, Lauren Sanchez showed up at the Aman Luxury Hotel in Venice, and they showed up in a water taxi, which is how you get there, and just waved at all the little people as they came by.
You guys, this is the royal wedding part 2. This is the event of the century.
Is it? Pardon you, excited. Todd Chrisley's getting out.
Let's get some Diddy talk out of the way.
Let's do it.
Closing
It's all I ever talk about anymore if you've listened to the podcast.
Yes, you have been covering this week after week.
Yeah.
Closing arguments are unfolding as we are sitting here right now. What is your prediction of where this is going to end up once the jury deliberates?
Money, power, influence, violence, and fear. To the feds, that is a recipe for racketeering. And in a federal courtroom today in Manhattan, the prosecution team in the Sean Diddy Combs trial made it crystal clear to the jury that it does not matter if you're not a mob family like the Gaudis. It doesn't matter if, say, you're a rap music mogul like Diddy. The law is the law, and Diddy broke it over and over again, they said. In her 4-hour closing argument today, Assistant U.S. Attorney Christy Slavic made it real easy for this jury. She told them they don't even have to believe everything that the prosecutors have laid out over these last 7 weeks. She said it only takes one single freak-off that was the product of force or fraud or coercion. And that, she said, equals sex trafficking, period. The mere act of supplying people in those freak-offs with drugs, that includes enough crimes right there to equal racketeering, she said. Prosecutor insisted that Diddy used his bad boy entertainment employees to keep the cocaine, the ketamine, the ecstasy, and the other drugs flowing, and the freak-off participants awake and compliant. But she said that he also allegedly used those same assistants and his security staff for crimes that an old-school mob boss might recognize. Crimes like kidnapping. Here are the cases that the prosecutor actually laid out. She said that Cassie Ventura was forced to stay in a hotel for a full week in 2009 until her bruises were no longer visible after being beaten by Diddy. And that an ex-Diddy employee named Capricorn Clark was kidnapped twice. Once by a Diddy stooge named Uncle Polly, they said, who threatened to dump her body in the East River. And another time by Diddy himself, they said, while on a mission to kill the rapper Kid Cudi, who was dating Cassie at the time. As for another racketeering crime, arson. The prosecutor said Diddy's alleged firebombing of Kid Cudi's Porsche certainly does count, as does bribery. When the prosecutor reminded the jury of the $100,000 that Diddy allegedly paid to keep that hotel surveillance video of Cassie being beaten senseless under wraps. As far as the sex trafficking charges go, the government told the jury that just because Cassie and Jane may have been willing in some of the freak-offs does not mean they consented to all of them. And they said it only takes one. If they didn't consent to one, then it's sex trafficking, then it's forced labor. Diddy refused to take no for an answer, the prosecutor said, and rarely in his adult life did he have to. But now, she said, it is time to hold him accountable. And believe me when I tell you, I have literally just skimmed the surface of a speech that went on almost 5 hours and tease up the defense for an uphill climb in their closing arguments tomorrow. Joining me now to dig a little deeper is Emily Hagan, who has been reporting from the Diddy trial for weeks now. First of all, Emily, did I get your name right? Emily Hagan?
You did.
Is that the right pronunciation?
Thanks, Ashley.
Okay, good. Good. All right, so I saw your TikTok today, and you talked about a vibe shift. Tell me about that.
100%. I've been covering this since jury selection, and up until today, I feel like the content creators and it's kind of felt like a circus out there. I'm going to be honest. It's like everyone's out there live streaming, they're making their TikToks, people are fighting on the streets. But today, it was as eerie as how the weather was in New York. It was cloudy. People came into the courtroom and it was like they sucked all the energy out of you like a vacuum. And even Diddy himself's body language mirrored all of the reporters in the crowd and the hundreds of law students that traveled across the country today to come and fill up 3 overflow rooms, which we haven't seen yet. Usually when I get to court, they say, go up to room 24B. That's the overflow room if you can't make it into the main courtroom. Today, they were like, head up to 15A. They had opened up 2 extra overflow rooms because that is how much attention this case drew on the closing day. So it was a really crazy vibe shift, Ashley.
Well, so the vibe shift, like people screaming outside, people angry about getting, a place, and like it was aggressive.
There's always that. So I don't know if you've been seeing all the TikToks, but people are screaming every day just to secure a spot in the courtroom. People are spending hundreds of dollars on line sitters just to sit in a courtroom. So people were aggressively pushing themselves to the front of the line today, like unlike anything I've ever seen before. But Usually in the overflow room, when we're hearing witnesses on the stand, there's like jokes being made by the judge. And today there was just none of that. It was the prosecutors brought such a strong case and they were so serious that nobody was moving. Everybody was completely still, including Diddy, who he's normally like passing notes, making jokes to Tenny Garagos. And today he was sitting back in his chair, completely still, almost like a statue. I feel like it is the final act and it is finally hitting him that this is not a Wild King night. This is not a show anymore. Like, this is reality sinking in for him and for everybody at the case.
Yeah, like everything just got real. Listen, when I saw sort of like soup to nuts, how the prosecutors summed this all up for the jury, all I could say was like, damn, is that easy to see? You know, it just made it so crystal clear and easy. And, you know, for everybody out there who's just been dabbling or watching a headline here and there or some social media on it, a lot of people thought, nah, no way. This isn't sex trafficking. This isn't racketeering. Did it feel a little different now?
Yeah, I mean, today I felt like before today, everyone was like, Diddy's going free. Like, he's going to have a freak off next week. People literally thought Diddy's going free. And then today, everyone was kind of looking around. Once they had that PowerPoint up on the screen, I feel like it really made it easy for people to finally put the pieces together and understand. It's almost like the prosecutors realized how confusing this RICO was for the general public. And they dumbed it down as much as they could for the jury, as if they were giving like a college presentation. And I feel like up until today, people didn't realize how simple it was to prove a RICO. And now everyone's like, wait, is he going to jail for life? Now, maybe not. I think they're going to have a hard time proving the criminal enterprise, but all of the predicate acts, they almost seem like they could hit every one today. I don't know if that's what you felt.
I did, but I have felt that way since the beginning. Like, literally, I've been watching and ticking boxes every single day saying, oh, they got that one. Oh, they got that one too. Damn, they got that one. So I've been like keeping a scorecard for 7 weeks, and I've just sort of been flummoxed by all these people out there saying this isn't trafficking and this isn't racketeering. I've seen the Southern District of New York do a sex trafficking and RICO charge with someone I know. So I really feel like they nailed this one. And I feel like you said they nailed it on each and every one.
I did. And I think the reason that the public has been kind of saying that, is it Diddy?
Yeah, that was my son. He does this all the time, Emily. That is my son, and he's almost 20, and he still doesn't know when I'm live on TV.
You got to put it on vibrate, Ashley. So, yeah,
I know, such a dumb move. Dumb move.
No, that was louder than the courtroom today. Like, I'm telling you, it was so quiet. It's usually very bizarre, and I feel like today, the people were like, wait, we're actually at a court trial. I feel like up until today, people thought this was just like one big happy hour. Like, the creators are picking their favorite football team, making bets. And today we're like, wait, this is actually a real trial for Diddy. And it just got a little bit, I don't know, it's a little too real. And then we saw the daughters today for the first time. The twins came. We haven't seen them since week 1. They were there the first week supporting their father. And then today they walked in matching white pinstripe suits, holding their sister Chance's hand. And it just felt really emotional for everybody. And I feel like people at the case are getting really connected to it. But to your point as to why people, maybe you thought the RICO was a RICO, but everyone else thought it was a FRICO. And I think it's because of how charismatic the defense team is. Today, when the prosecutor got up on the stand, someone was like, how do you feel like she did? And I was like, I'm going to be honest with you. I couldn't even tell you her name. All the prosecutors this whole trial feel like they're just substitute teachers. But when the defense gets up there, it's like we're watching the Shawshank Redemption. They are putting on a show. And not only that, they are schmoozing with all of the content creators in the courtroom. Brian Steele's coming up to me going like this. Javier Donaldson's performing so much where the judge has to say, can you come back to the microphone? Like, we can't hear you. And they're schmoozing with us. So they're kind of gaining the trust of the content creators. So then we're going home, we're publishing this to our audience, and the public is like, Diddy's getting off. But then when the prosecutors are in the room, they don't even look our way. They mean business.
You know what? I saw that with the jazz hands of Johnny Cochran. So now I can't be snowed at all. Hey, Emily, thank you so much for this. Really great in the courtroom, and I want to have you back. Will you come back?
Definitely. Hopefully we'll have a verdict soon, because I can't be living here talking about baby oil forever.
Right? And it's summer. I know. Thank you so much for this. I'll be talking to you again soon. Emily Hagen joining us. And then I also want to run this by one of my favorite defense attorneys and happens to be a former prosecutor, Mark Eiglarsh. I keep saying that the prosecutors stuck the landing today. Do you think they did?
I thought they did an extremely effective job. But as always, I got to warn you, Ashley, you're doing something that I think is a little premature. You're popping the bubbly, you're dancing around, and you're excited that he's going to be convicted. Guess what? There's this little thing called the defense closing. You might want to listen to that too. I'm just saying.
You know I will, and you know I'm excited for it. I always say when the C has been oblivious to this methodical case being laid out quietly by substitute teacher-styled prosecutors, they shouldn't be ignored. They did exactly what they had to do. I'm not excited for anyone to go to prison. I am excited for justice. I am excited when people do their jobs and they do them well. I think that's what I saw today. I saw prosecutors doing their job real well, and I saw an uphill climb tomorrow, a hole to dig out for Diddy.
Okay, so yes, they did an effective job. They took a charge that all of us thought was reserved for Al Capone, the mafia, organized crime, and they applied it to the Tony Montana of the lube world. It was very effective. That said, she's not going to get up there tomorrow, Terry Garagos, and go, blah, 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 I guess, I got nothing to say. She's got a plan. She's going to explain why each element does not apply to Diddy. And all it takes is one. So, listen to what's being said. Do exactly what the judge tells the jurors. Do not make a final decision until after all the evidence is in and after you hear from both sides.
Yeah. All the way along, I've been hearing under cross-examination how they're fighting. And then seeing that they didn't put up a case really surprised me. I believed that it wasn't because they thought the prosecutors hadn't proved the case. I believed it's because they can't find somebody who's unimpeachable to help Diddy prove his case. And so it's all going to be Johnny Cochran jazz hands when it comes to the closing. And I agree. Once you hear one side, you're right in the tank, right? Feels like fish in a barrel. The other side will change things, and then they get the last word. And I do feel like when they say it only takes 2 predicate acts, they've lined up a buffet of like dozens of these predicate acts, and it is a little like shooting fish in a barrel.
Yeah, let me say this. I rarely put on a case, and I win a lot of my cases, and that's because you poke holes legally in the government's case. You say, okay, if this happened, did they really meet each and every element? And I think that they're vulnerable in certain instances. And I also am not convinced that they're going to find that this was coercion. There are many instances of...
It's Lauren LaRosa here talking about my guys over...
Tonight, we are heading into the final stretch of the bombshell criminal trial of Sean Diddy Combs. In a marathon session that lasted nearly 5 hours, the prosecution presented its closing argument to the jury today. Assistant U.S. Attorney Christy Slavic highlighting the lurid government evidence that the jury has been shown during the course of this trial, including the video of Combs' 2016 hotel assault on Cassie Ventura, pictures of a bruised and beaten Ventura,